So hi and welcome. Welcome to these two short talks on writing about research and most importantly on how to write a proposal for a grant or a fellowship. Now in this first talk I'll cover some broad global features of writing, and then in the second talk we'll look at a few features of writing such as paragraphs and sentences in more detail. Now to briefly introduce myself, I'm Jeff Hyde, and up until last year I was working full-time at the National Centre for Biological Sciences in Bangalore. I'd been there for 8 years, running courses and workshops on research communication skills. Before that, I was doing cell biology research for 15 years, including running my own lab for about 8 years at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. So that's all I have to say about myself right now. If you want to see more about me, look up my LinkedIn profile. Now it's time to think more about you. Now, given that you're applying for a Wellcome Trust Fellowship, I can put on my Sherlock Holmes hat and deduce that you're very intelligent, you know how to do very good science, and that by now you also know how to write up that good science in a research paper. Now you might be thinking to yourself, isn't that enough? Isn't that enough of a skill set for writing up a grant? Well, for some of you that may well be the case, but probably not for all of you. The evidence doesn't back it up. Well, at least for previous batches of applicants for these fellowships by the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance. The Alliance has asked me to do these workshops because the reviewers of the previous batches felt the writing needed some improvement. Now, you might be thinking, why isn't a grant agency like the Alliance just focused on the science? What's all this fuss about the writing? Well, I can categorically assure you that the reviewers are totally focused on the science. And the only reason they would complain about the writing is that when a grant is poorly written, they can't see the science. The signal is getting lost in the noise. Now the next question is why? Why hasn't your previous experience been enough? Well, the process of writing a grant or a fellowship has some similarities to writing a paper, but it is different. So you can build on what you already know about paper writing. That's good, but you have to go further. And you need to understand what you are doing more consciously. When writing a paper, you already know how to choose the right journal, and you know how to write up the paper to fit in with the sort of community targeted by that journal. There are all sorts of traditions and individual requirements when you pick one journal rather than another. Well, you have to do that with granting agencies too, which means you have to understand the background, the goals, and the idiosyncrasies of each particular agency. And these can vary even more than with a journal. But what's even more important from the point of view of writing is that you will often have to write about things that are probably outside your current comfort zone, if we can call it that. That is, you're writing about things outside the scope of science. You will have to write about people, the people involved in the project, including a lot about yourself. That's rather difficult for most scientists. We tend to be shyer types. But the personal angle is critical, and especially so in a fellowship application. Basically, the granting agency wants to know if your track record, your career arc to date, suggests that you are a scientist worth betting on. We all know research is a demanding game. It requires you to be able to think outside the box. So they want to know from your application, do you seem to have both the steeliness and the spark required to thrive? And perhaps even more foreign is that when you're writing a grant or a fellowship application, you always have to deal with matters of money. You will have to present a case for the budget. Now, just like writing about ourselves, writing about money does not come easily to most scientists. But a granting agency, like anyone else, does not like to give their funds away. They really want to see that you have thought very carefully about the affordability and the overall feasibility of what you're proposing to do. Now, in these short talks, I don't have the time to be going into the specifics about how to write about either yourself or the budget. But what I do want to point out from the writing point of view is that when anyone has to write about things that she or he is not comfortable with, the quality of the writing goes down. And also what can happen is that the anxiety associated with writing a difficult section can affect the quality of the writing in the sections where the writer does feel more at home. But even if writing about these topics does not worry you, there is even a bigger reason why paper writing doesn't quite prepare you for grant writing. And it's a reason that many people haven't really thought through. The process of writing papers can give many people a false sense of confidence about their own writing abilities. This is because you might redraft a paper a dozen or so more times before you send it off. And then it goes through several rounds of revision before you get to publish it. Or your co-authors would have read each draft, maybe other people in the lab, and then there's the reviewers. Now with grants, all this time and assistance is missing. The finished grant typically has a very limited incubation time because you're working to a deadline. That makes all the difference. There are only a few drafts. Your grant doesn't get as many inputs from other people, sometimes none. Basically, therefore, when you're writing a grant, you want to have enough skill to write a really great first draft. So those are all the problems, and it is a good start to know they exist. But now let's turn to something better, solutions. Now I'll be suggesting two strategies in these talks. First one is easy to understand, but harder to implement, time management. Obviously, if you can avoid leaving your application to the last minute, you'll make grant writing more like paper writing. Easier said than done, but it is something to aim for. And one thing that I'd like to point out is that even professional writers prefer lots of time. And it doesn't have to be one big block of time that stops your research work dead. In fact, it's better if it isn't. For example, journalists, when they're working on a long feature story, they will often write it over a period of months. Meanwhile, they're doing other stories. The breaks in between allow them to look at what they're doing more objectively. You may already know one very famous mini version of this strategy, used by all top writers. It's this: sleep on it. Do a draft, then put it aside, maybe for one, maybe 2 nights, and go back to your normal research activities. When you now come back to your draft with fresh eyes, you will almost certainly see problems with the writing, really obvious ones. And if you haven't done this before, you are in for quite a shock to see just how raw your first drafts really are. A second, more detailed but useful strategy: find out more about the features that good research writing has. And that, of course, is going to be the focus of the rest of my 2 talks. Trying to make you more aware, more conscious of what your readers, the reviewers, are expecting, and therefore what you should be doing. Now, of course, there are many other resources out there. And in particular, I recommend this book, Writing Science, by Joshua Schimmel. If you like my general approach, then you will probably like his too, because we've both come to very similar conclusions about how to write about research. But I am a scientist, and therefore I must have one caveat. One of the most peculiar things about writing and learning to write is that there is no truly objective measure of its quality. This is very different from when, say, you were learning maths at school or learning to play some sport, say tennis. In those situations, you know when you're doing well, when you're doing things correctly. Your maths answer matches the one in the back of the book, the ball goes over the net. But that doesn't happen in writing. There's no exact right answer. So it's much harder to learn to do and much harder to learn how to do it. So how can you be sure that what I'm telling you, or anyone else for that matter, is true? Well, you can't. And likewise, I can't guarantee that it's the best advice for each and every one of you. Many writers compare writing to music, and one of the similarities is that they are both very personal. There's no single one best style. But we can think of it this way. In music, we all know when a piece has got good rhythm. Even babies know that. They dance to it. Rhythm is a very basic aspect of a musical piece. Simple, but it has to be right. Well, in these talks, what I will be suggesting are ways to make sure that your writing has an unmissable underlying structure, a sort of strong baseline, so to speak, because that is the most basic expectation that your readers will have, probably unconsciously, when they're reading what you've written. We won't be concerning ourselves with the more sophisticated aspects of writing, the melody line as it were, because there is more uncertainty about what works best. And as to whether the reviewers of your fellowship application will dance to it, that is something I definitely can't guarantee. So for the rest of this video and the next one, we'll be looking briefly at what makes good writing good. We'll consider the main thrust of the proposal and also its paragraphs, even its sentences. Now you might think that's a lot to cover, and it is. Now, wouldn't it be good if there was one simple approach to remember, a central principle perhaps, that you could apply in all those different contexts? Well, good news. There is. It's called the story. If you want to write a good paper or a good grant, you must be telling one big story, and the big story itself must be made up of little stories. Now, for many people, this is a shock. Science, on the one hand, is focused on truth and reality. Stories, however, are about fiction, making things up. More people are likely to associate storytelling with someone like our friend here, Pinocchio, a compulsive liar. But this is not what you'll hear when you listen to the people who are heavily involved in scientific writing. For example, the editors of major journals and the authors of books on how to improve writing about research. They all stress that no matter how good the content is, it must be packaged. And the very best way to package it, they all say, is as a story. Now, in more recent times, it's quite interesting that many biologists and evolutionists are proposing that the ability to tell a story, and likewise the capacity to listen to one, has evolved specifically to allow us humans to transmit complex information in the most efficient form possible. The story form is thought to provide for the storyteller simple guidelines on how to organize the information that they are addressing. And on the other hand, for the listener, that information becomes interesting, it becomes digestible, and most essentially of all, the story allows the embedded information to stick in the listener's brain so that she or he can perhaps profit from an increased awareness at some later point. Now, the most critical requirement of storytelling is that the audience becomes immersed in the story. That is, they are not just listening to the information, they are basically reliving the information. In the same way that a flight simulator prepares a trainee pilot for a real flight, stories allow us to experience in a very deep and useful way the world as someone else has already experienced it. Now, knowing this, it's already useful for you. If you've finished your first draft and you go back and read it, preferably after a night's rest, ask yourself this question. Does it engage you the whole way through? Do you get drawn into the drama of the project? Score it out of 10, just like you would for a movie. If it's not at least a 7, say, something is wrong. Because if you're not excited, if you're not immersed, the reviewers won't be either. And remember our tennis analogy from a little while back. Well, now you know that your ball, your writing ball, has not gone over the net, it's gone into it. Now, let's assume you've looked at your proposal and it's not engaging. Why might this be so? What might your grant be missing that we would normally expect to find in a story? Well, there has been a lot of research into the features that we always find in stories, the features that stories from all around the world share in common. Now, some of these features are obvious. For example, a story always involves a character, usually a hero. Less obvious perhaps, at least until you think about it, but also absolutely universal, is that a story is anchored to a timeline. Later events in the story are, by and large, the result of earlier events. The events might not always be presented in their strict chronological order. You think about the movie Pulp Fiction, or even the Star Wars series. But there is, nevertheless, an order that can be reconstructed by the audience. Now, luckily, this chronological feature is all very easy to apply when writing a proposal, because the most natural organising principle for a grant is chronology. When one considers the various subsections of a grant or a research paper, at least in biology, the content expected is nearly always following a very simple, strict chronological order. It's more like a story from Tintin than, say, Pulp Fiction. Let's think about how it works in practice. The main body of a proposal will launch with some big issue in research. Then you will mention the general approaches that other researchers are taking to address it. And then this all leads to some reasonably specific research goal. Now, up until this point, the grant is still focused on the biology. But now, the existence of the biological problem leads us to the experimental approaches, things we can actually do. And then we have to narrow down further again, getting more specific about those experimental approaches. Eventually, this all leads us to be able to point out a plan that is feasible with the money, equipment and personnel that would be available if the proposal is successful. Before going further in this direction, I want to take 1 minute to explain why young researchers tend to go wrong in terms of the chronology. Now, scientists in the early phases of their career are largely being selected on the basis of how good they are at doing experiments. If you didn't like experiments and you weren't good at them, you wouldn't have got to where you are now. So this means that when young researchers start to write about their research, they tend to rush into the experimental side of things, not paying proper attention to the background, the motivation for what they're doing in the first place. If we go back to our tennis analogy, it's like the tennis player who rushes their shots, who swings at the ball before it reaches them. It's not a good look. So here's a thought. At this stage of your career, your experimental abilities are not really in doubt. Now you're being selected on the basis of your ability to see and to discuss the context in which your experiments become meaningful. Now, merely relating a series of events in chronological order, of course, is not enough to create interest. Stories are interesting because the key events in a plot are problems, and solutions, that's from the hero's point of view, or questions and answers as we experience it as the audience. And that's important, more important for us to be considering as authors. In a story, there will always be one very engaging question posed near the start of the story. Can the hero overcome some major obstacle X? The hero's attempts to overcome that problem will generate a series of minor questions for the audience. For example, can the hero overcome minor obstacle A, then B, then C? These minor questions are nested within the major question. Now, this hierarchical approach guarantees that the story will have a strong and gripping structure. For the reader or audience, the questions that emerge from the plotline exert the same sort of fascination that the scoreline does for a spectator watching some sports event. A tennis fan, for example, in addition to the complex pleasure of enjoying the artistry of the game, at a more basic level, will also be fixated on a series of very simple and hierarchical questions. Who will win the match? Who will win this set, this game, this point? Let's look at an example of a story, the movie Titanic. As the story unfolds, we soon find that the central driving question focuses on the heroine, Rose. And it could be stated something like this. Can young Rose escape her restrictive upper-class life, and especially her cruel fiancé Cal, and thus realise her true self? Now, many minor questions gradually emerge from this major question. As one example, the important question underlying the scene in which Rose is taught to spit by Jack seems to be this. Is Rose actually ready to do all the things that she says she wants to do? Or in other words, is she all talk? One final feature of stories concerns what we might call its message. In most stories, the major driving question not only has questions flowing from it, but it has one or more questions above it. These overarching questions will necessarily be of grander scope than the driving question, but they are too grand to actually drive the plot. In Titanic, one such grand question seems to be posed indirectly during the interactions at the very start between the older, present-day Rose and the crew of the research vessel. And it might be stated like this: should we be sensible in our life, or should we follow our heart? In Star Wars, the overarching message level question concerns the relative merits, of course, of the dark and light sides of the Force. Now let's look at how this question-based hierarchy applies to a grant. Here we have the main driving question of a proposed study. Can altered lipid metabolism in Drosophila cause neurodegeneration? Like most driving questions in research, it concerns the real world, in this case, the biology and pathology of a real organism. As it stands, however, it's not yet a question that we can go to the lab and make relevant observations about. For that, we need some experimental proxy for each of the real-world topics of interest. One such experimental question might be, does suppression of lipid metabolism genes lead to elevated fuscin levels in brain neurons? This is the sort of specific question that we can answer by collecting data. And overarching all these questions is an even bigger biological question. Can altered lipid metabolism in humans cause neurodegeneration? It needs to be discussed in the earlier part of the proposal or grant, but grand questions like this have a rather loose logical connection to the actual research question. So being a scientist, someone who's very logical, we hope, you don't want to get too carried away by these grand questions. Now, up until this point, we have been focusing purely on questions. And in your Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance Fellowship application, you do not need to worry about anything else but the questions. But in many, if not most of the proposals you write for other agencies in your career, you will need to consider the other side of the equation, answers. So I want to finish up this talk by looking at answers and their relationship to questions. In the fictional world, if we consider a happy ending type of story, as the various minor questions are gradually resolved in the affirmative during the middle of the story, the hero attains the capacities to take on the major obstacle of the climax. In a research paper, the answers play a huge part. They will be what your readers are most excited about. On the other hand, a proposal is focused more on questions. Nevertheless, you are still expected to spend some time in considering possible results, findings, and outcomes. Some granting agencies even require the authors to include graphs and tables of the sort they expect to put in the finished research paper. Now, let's consider some of the various terms we might use when writing a proposal. Big issue, research aim, experimental objective, result, finding, outcome. These are actually just a small subset of all the generic words that people use to describe the key points of a research project. Others include the hypothesis, insights, elucidation, and so on and so forth. Now, what's important is that all these key terms can be categorized into two groups, as either a question or an answer. They vary only in scope, being more general or more specific. And as we write the main body of the proposal, we just work through this sequence in a very simple, ordered, chronological way, working down the hierarchy and then up, making sure that every question that is raised over here on the left is matched with some possible answer later. Now, as you write your proposal, you will need, of course, to elaborate upon this simple framework. For example, and most importantly, you need to justify these connections between the questions and between the answers. Why are we posing our particular experimental question, for example, rather than some of the many other possible questions? For the answers, what allows us to infer a more general answer from a specific one? Now, this elaboration is not something I have time to consider in these talks. But as you're doing it yourselves, keep in mind that your big challenge is to make sure that this underlying question-answer framework is not obscured. What you want to end up with, to use the various analogies used in this talk, is music with a clear rhythm, a game with a scoreline, and most importantly of all, a story with a plot.